And so the Spanish take him captive. They start to ask for riches because you have to remember the people thought he was a god, right? So they saw Moctezuma as a god, and so they start finding all their riches, bringing all their stuff to the temple, and then they start questioning, well, is he still alive? Because we haven't seen him. And so the Spanish are like, let's let him see him, so they understand that he's okay. You know, we're sticking to our word or whatever, right? And so they bring him out, and he's standing in the front of the palace, and two conquistadors are holding him. Well, one of the people in the crowd, one of the Mexica in the crowd, picks up a rock and throws it, trying to hit the conquistador, so Moctezuma can be released, and instead he hits Moctezuma on the head, and it kills him. And so all hell breaks loose, and so there's this big old battle. They're all fighting, and what ends up happening is the Spanish get out of Tenochtitlan, and then they blockade all the entryways so they can't bring in fresh food and stuff like that. And then they send in like people that were sick with like scarlet fever or plague and shit like that in there, and expose all those people, the Mexica, to those illnesses, and they end up dying from stuff like that. And then they end up taking over Tenochtitlan, and building Mexico City on it. Um, and after that, they start bringing more and more people in, and they start changing things around a lot, and they start committing acts of genocide and ethnocide with the people, indigenous people of Mexico, and this is happening everywhere else too, like the Taino and in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean, they get wiped out almost completely, and then other groups as well, the Maya, the Incas. I mean, there's a number of indigenous groups from there, even in South America too, like the Condomble and people like that get completely wiped out because of the Spanish imperialism. And so I like this graphic here too because it's really like meaningful. It's like I'm gonna write the story of history, of our history, in the blood of the people we killed, and that's like pretty standard. Like I think like with imperialism, like we saw that a lot. It didn't matter like what group it was, the British, the French, the Spanish, even the Scandinavians earlier before that, the Moorish. I mean, it was always this was always been an element of history. So obviously there's huge impact as far as like genocide and things like that. So they start killing off lots of people, and it's through both the spreading of disease, and also because of the taking of resources and things like that. But then it's also because like sometimes they just killed people just because they wanted to, because they were different, right? And so these are a couple of interesting pictures where they're like taking out some of the Aztec people and stealing their resources and riches. Um, One of the other things that they implemented right after they came up with, when they took over. And so Hernan Cortez didn't finally take it for himself. He said, "No, I'll take it for Spain to claim it." And then he was given all these rewards for doing that. And part of it was becoming a landowner. So they took over the land and privatized it, so where each person could own certain tracts of land, and they start to survey it. And like when I say survey, it doesn't mean that they were like sitting out there with like a compass and like a measuring device, saying like, okay, from uh these coordinates to these coordinates is this. I mean, they were like from that rock over there to that stream, down the stream to over here to this big ass tree, and then back over here to the mountain, the base of the mountain. That's Jeff's land. That's more how it was. Like, so when you read these Spanish land grants, that's what they sounded like, right? So they acquired all this wealth, and they started one of the things that they started doing was they established this encomienda system. And so the encomienderos, they received this land, and anybody who was there with them were considered their property. And that included a labor source. So just like we see with the African American experience when they're brought in as enslaved people, um, and their labor's exploited, the same thing happened here. Although it was a little different because they weren't taken from their homelands and brought to somewhere else, like the enslaved people of Africa. The same thing applied here. They were slaves, or enslaved people, but it was more about exploiting the resources that were there connected to the people, and not just resources as far as their labor, but also resources like as far as land and stuff like that, and then also like other resources like lumber and things like that. And it's hard to say like lumber, but like other resources like even foods and things like that, a lot of it was based off of agriculture, because the Mayans and the Mexica were really good at that, and so they totally capitalized off of that. So bringing um like we talked about before, like tomatoes and aguacate and chocolate, and like I don't know, like there's a number of things like vanillas from this area too. Like we get chocolate and vanilla, like corn, all this stuff that ends up being staples, and then eventually potatoes and stuff like that from the Incas. And so they do that, and then they also want to convert them to Catholicism, right? So convert them to Christianity. Um, and so in reality, they really exploited their labor, and the conquerors often. This is a quote from Acuna. It says, "Conquerors often maltreated and abused the natives under their trust." And so they try to make it seem like, oh, we're protecting you all, like that's why you're part of this, but in reality it wasn't. They were totally exploiting their labor. And to give you an example of like how extensive it was Cortez himself had received land in the valley of Oaxaca, and with that land he had 2,300 subjects. So it almost went to like a serfdom style. I don't know if you guys remember. Do you guys remember the serfdom? Like learning about that? Yes, like give me a thumbs up at least, something.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Rebecca. So serfdom, right? And so they establish it just like that. So they're totally dependent on them, and then like another element is added, like because people start like saying this isn't right, so they start the repartimiento. And so repartimiento is basically what they did is they said, okay, yeah, yeah, you know what, we'll pay you all, but you have to buy everything from us. And so like they would, like, say you were one of these indigenous people and you were working the land and you grew corn, right? And like, so before that was your property. So like Guadalupe, you may have been one of those people that grew corn. So you grew corn for your family, and then you grew corn for you to barter and trade with, right? And so Guadalupe has all this corn before the Spanish come, right? And so she sells some of it, or trades some of it, I should say, and then she keeps some of it to sustain her family, right? Well, when the Spanish come and they take that away from her and that property is no longer hers, they say, look, okay, okay, you can. At first, they're like, all right, well, you can keep like a quarter of it, but the 3/4 of it we're gonna keep, and we're gonna sell. So now she doesn't have anything to barter with. She just has enough, not even enough to sustain her family. But then on top of that, when repartimiento happens, they say, okay, so you have that, and now we'll give you a little bit of money, but you can only buy stuff from us. And so all that corn that she produced, that she grew, she's having to buy from the Spanish crown. And so it was just totally messed up. It never changed. Like, it was this idea of like exploitation of labor, resources, all this stuff. Um, and so it didn't help in any way, because all it did was benefit the Spanish, so that was something that was also crazy. On top of that, they established the casta system there, la castas, and this was a caste system that was established by the Spanish, um, and it was because there was, after a while they noticed that there was a lot of children being born that were mestizo, right, or mixed. And so and like I told you before, like I had this romanticized idea of like what this was like, and in reality it was like because of rape and crazy shit like that mostly. And so we get like a large influx of people that were like, and then it ends up changing a little bit because people start to intermingle, and stuff like that. But so you get people that were, and you have to remember, like, there's a bunch of different people that were living here too. It was like when the Spanish came, they brought African enslaved people with them, and they also brought people that were of Jewish descent or whatever that had converted to Catholicism and were now living as Spanish Catholics. In reality, they were crypto Jews, and then people from Moorish backgrounds and stuff like that too. Um, so when they come and they start having kids, like, so this is how it broke down. So like this is the top layer, right? So there's like multiple layers of this. And so if you were Española or Español, like Spanish, like from Spain, and then you had uh, uh, a child with the India or like a native, right? There was a mestiza. And then if the mestiza, this is kind of where it gets kind of crazy. This is like all charted out, like they had it all like defined drawings of it and shit like that too. If the mestiza had a child with another Spaniard, that was a castizo. And then if the castizo had a child with another Spaniard, then they would be a Spaniard again. Even though they're like mixed with different bloodlines, they disregard that and make it Spanish. And the thing that's crazy too is that like people started to like the Spanish did census and stuff like that, and they would go around and take census of the populations. And what they did was they were like, "Yo, like if we have these people here and we count them as being Spanish, it makes us look like there's way more of us than there really are." And so we saw the same thing happen like with this group later on again too. So like when after the Mexican American War in 1848, when in 1850 when those lands are taken over by the United States, the people that were living there, like in New Mexico, like where we're at now, right, in places like that, and we become a territory, they're like, what do we do with the Mexicans that are there? And they say, hey, if you stay here, you become a U.S. citizen. And so people were like, I don't know, I don't even know what that means, but they're like, this is my land, so I'm gonna stay here and shit. You know what I mean? Like, fuck that, I'm not gonna leave. And so they stay, and then when the United States does a census, they count them as white. Why would they do that? Why would they count them as white like during that time? Because before that they were Mexicans, right? They weren't they were even seen as indigenous peoples. Like I've read like scripts written from different policymakers and leaders during that time for the United States, and they were like the natives or the Indians of Mexico. Those were quotes from them. Um, and then all of a sudden they're white. Why? Why do you think that?
I believe it's because like most of the because everything starts at the 13 colonies, are the 13 colonies in the United States, right? So when they get this territory, I believe like they wanna keep having the power that they used to have right there, and so they decided to call them white because I don't know, but what I think is like they wanted to make sure that they can get later on the territory.
Yeah,
It can, yeah.
and you're right, like Jeff. That's pretty much why. So they're like, if we keep this, and people here are considered that, then politically it helps us, right? Because it's like it doesn't change. Like we're not changing that dynamic that we had before, like on the East Coast, and even spreading westward. Like you guys know the word manifest destiny, right? You heard that before. Well, the westward expansion, other part of it too was that they were like, how do we get people to feel comfortable being around these indigenous peoples when we've been telling them this whole time that they're the devil and like all this stuff, you know what I mean? And they're savages and all this, right? So how do we alleviate that? Well, let's say no, they're part European, so they're white. And so that was another way of doing it. So they got more people to come out here too, because people didn't want to come because they were afraid, like, oh, I don't want to get attacked by these savages, right? Like they didn't want that. And so to get more people to move westward, they did that as well. And so it was like this whole political and socio-political element to like the westward expansion to even include um uh identifying people as that too. And then later on it's going to help with in regard to representation and stuff like that too for demographics, and that's not going to be till like the early 1900s. But that's what happens early on. So it's kind of an interesting thing when you break this down, and then so you get people like, I don't, did I talk about this with you guys whenever that dude from UNM was trying to say that he was um Spanish? Did I talk about that with you all?
I don't think so.
So there's this professor at UNM, and they did a story on this on, I think it was on KRQE. And this was like right whenever ancestry.com started like really like taking off. And so this dude from UNM. I think he's a professor in the School of Economics or something like that. And it was weird because it had like nothing to do with history or anything. I mean, like economics is attached to history, but it didn't have anything to do with that, like Mexican American history or something. But he had all these documents of his um, ancestors here in New Mexico, um, where it said that where they all said that, oh, we're Spanish, like it was always on there. And so he was like they had like marriage records and like demographic information that was collected by the U.S. government, like during territorial periods in New Mexico, where these people were said they were Spanish, and then even like a land grant and stuff like that. And so he had all this documentation, and then so they had him do a DNA test for Ancestry.com, and he came back and he was like 76% indigenous. And he was like, no, 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 this is wrong. I'm Spanish. And it was only like, he was only like 16% or something Spanish. And so he was like, no, 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 this is wrong. And then like, so they started talking about how people back then, like, they understood that because of La Castas and the way they were treated, if you said you were indigenous or you said you were a mestiza, they treated you different. But if you said you were Spanish, they treated you better. And so a lot of people would be like, oh, yep, Spanish, like check the box, you know what I mean? Because it made it easier for them. And so that's what ended up probably happening to him. And then the other thing too is like, he's from New Mexico, and you know, there was a lot of intermixing between people here, especially in the indigenous groups. So that was kind of a whole other part. And so after he was just like flabbergasted that like he wasn't like 100% Spanish. Um, and I mean that's something that like you consider whenever you look at this, and you can see how that happens. Like right here, this person's Indian and their child is mixed, and then by the time they have children, their kid could be a Spaniard again, based on the Costa, and so like that didn't help in regard to that either. And so it's kind of a whole interesting thing in regard to that, because in the end, like people from this group are very the reason, like I said, it's important to talk about them too is like the experience is shared with this group because it's highly influenced by various things. It's not just like remember we talked about La Raza Cosmica. It's because like we're the mestizo group that's like global, if you will. You know what I mean? Like so we have like the European blood, the African blood, and then the indigenous blood running through our veins. And so you know, that's one thing that's kind of interesting about this group and why it's important, because like some of the stuff that we learn about here, like, and we find out in our culture is attached to like African roots that we see like practice in African American culture. You know what I mean? So it's kind of cool. And so we'll see that and we'll share those things too. The Inquisition, we talked about like them converting people to Christianity or Catholicism, and that was a huge thing too, because it was basically like we saw like we hear about the Salem witch trials, right, and like witch hunts and stuff like that. So the same thing occurred, except instead of it being a witch, you being a witch, you were a heretic, right? So you were still practicing your pagan faith, and so people would die obviously for it. You see this picture here. This is a picture of them torturing individuals who were considered to be heretics or practicing pagan faiths. What I want you to do real quick too is just put your hands behind your back, like if you were being arrested. You know what I mean? Like, hopefully you haven't felt like this before. But yes, I have. I'm sorry, and just being honest. So put your hands behind your back real quick, and just grab your hands together and just hold it there. And so what happened is like if you were accused, so like say Rebecca was accused of practicing her pagan beliefs and still practice praying to her Azteca or Mexica gods, she would be put to the question. And so that means what they would do is they'd go and they'd torture you. One of the ones that they really like to do in Mexico and in the Southwest was they would tie your hands behind your back. See this pulley system up here? That's what they would do. So they would tie your hands to your back, and they'd tie that rope to you, and then they'd pull you up off of the ground and ask you questions. So the Rebecca, they'd be like, Rebecca, are you practicing your Mexica religion? And you would be like, and maybe you weren't, maybe you were like, no, I'm not gonna do that anymore because I saw this other shit happen, and someone just accused you, and you're like, no, no, I didn't do it. And then they would say, don't lie to us, tell us the truth. We can see it in your eyes. Only God knows what's happening, if you're telling the truth or not. And then you would say, no, no. And then what they would do is they'd get weights and tie them to your feet and then pull you up again. And so your shoulders would get like torn out of socket. Your arms, sometimes people's arms would break and stuff like that from the pressure. And then you want the pain to stop, right? So you say, no, yes, yes, I have been, and then they're like, okay, well, we're gonna have you repent your sins by torturing you and then probably killing you. There's a great book called Ambivalent Conquest. If you ever want to read that, it's excellent, and it talks about it has like um firsthand accounts from stories told by indigenous people that were living there and what it was really like, and then also firsthand accounts from from Spaniards and stuff like that that were um frustrated with how the indigenous population was being treated. So it's a great book and it's really truthful and honest. So it's called Ambivalent Conquest. I should always like I don't know I forget to like include that book in my excerpts and stuff, but maybe I'll try to look into that. But that's a great one because it gives those stories. When I was blown away from this by this was I was traveling in Europe with my wife. This was like in 2008 probably, yeah, 2008, summer of 2008, and we were in Assisi, Italy, which is where Saint Francis is from. You know, like the monk, you know, like with the birds on him and shit. You know, like Saint Francis of Assisi. So we went to where he was, where his city or his town was, and it's beautiful. It's like on the Tuscan countryside, you know, all these beautiful sunflowers and all this vegetation growing, and you have to walk through these sunflowers to get to this road that leads up this mountain, and and that little town is on a mountain, and it's all made out of this beautiful white stone. Um, Beautiful place. And we get up there and we're exploring and stuff like that, and it's really fun. We're having a good time, and we run into this little museum, and it was torture museum from the Spanish Inquisition. Uh, and and so we were like, let's go check it out. And so we went inside there and looked, and we saw these. They had all these real medieval torture devices that they used during the Inquisition, and all this stuff. Um, and then one of the ones that blew me away was I saw this. It was a grill, and they made it out of wrought iron. You know, like the wrought iron that goes in front of your door and shit, or windows here in Albuquerque, so people don't break in your house and shit. Like it was made out of wrought iron, and it went over to open flame. And what they would do is they'd put people on it and ask them if you know if you were putting them to the question on there. The crazy part is I looked at, you know, I'd have like a little placard that says like the date they were from and all that shit. Well, I looked at it. Guess where it was from? Santa Fe, New Mexico. So I was all the way on the other side of the world in Italy, and I run into this museum, and they have artifacts from the Spanish Inquisition, putting people to the question in there from Santa Fe. And so that was like I was like, wow, this is crazy. You know what I mean? And like I remember telling the person there, I was like, oh, this is like by where we're from. We're from Albuquerque, and they're like, oh yeah, yeah, we actually have it. And then they showed me another one, which was um like a thing they used to whip people with, like the cattails. You guys heard of those? Some of those. So that's how that went down, and a lot of it was to control and things like that people as well. These are paintings from of the Black Legend paintings by Debray, who captured the killing of the indigenous peoples from by the Spanish and the British and people like that, the French. Um, in art form, and this is one where this is where they were killing the Taino in the Caribbean, and so they're torturing all these people. Like this shit really happened. They hang them and torture them from the bottom, and this guy's just gonna smack that baby on the wall there and kill it. And so they in Española, which is not Española in Mexico, Española in the Caribbean, which is like Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There was an indigenous population there, and they killed all of them. Like there was none left. All of them were killed and wiped out. Bartolome de las Casas was another ally for the indigenous peoples. He was the protector general of the Indians from uh, um, the Spanish, and his whole thing was to try to fight to protect the indigenous peoples. And he wrote this papal bull or like a law um, that declared that Indians should be free, and the crown passed it and prohibited the allocation of Indian lands to colonists. But it didn't work because over here, I mean, you have to remember this. It was months out, so like a message from Spain to get to New Spain took several months to get there on boats, right? And so the Spaniards say I obey, but I do not comply. Oh, okay, I hear that's law, but I'm not gonna follow it. And so that was the mentality they have in regard to it. This is a graphic here showing the decline in population just in Mexico. So the genocide and ethnicide occurred from 25 million to 1.2 million in 100 years. So this is attributed to the killings, floggings, overwork, malnutrition, poor hygiene, starvation, and disease, and it caused more than 90% of the Indian population to be wiped out by 1650. And it's even crazier when you look at the graphic for the indigenous population from North America and Central America. Like you're talking like almost like 80,000, 70 million people just get completely wiped out because of this. Like this number is actually higher now. Like it's not they say it's like more like between 30 and 40 million um after they review the more of the data, and so it drops significantly because of the killings in North America. And I talk about this later, I might bring it up twice, so just to warn you. But in North America, we went from like having around 20 million indigenous people. I mean, what is now the United States, when contact happened in the early 1600s, to 1800 having only 250,000. So you're talking like the wiping out of like we said, like similar, like over 90% of the population. And so that's a hard thing to think about. And a lot of it was based off of like we said, like genocide, and then also stripping of identity and stuff like that too. But this was like straight up death of people. Like this is like people dying, not like converting to Catholicism and stuff like that. Um, One thing I wanted to talk about too is just to add on to it is like women in colonial Central America was also an interesting subject too, because before that, before the Spanish came, women could generally marry and things like that. They could hold property too, so you could be a property owner when you're a woman. When the Spanish come, you couldn't. Um, that was like a European thing. So like a lot of like chauvinistic and stuff like that ideas came along across the Atlantic with the Europeans. And so a lot, even with that, like I always give this example of marriage. Like typically during before contact happened, like women in Mexico or colonial Central America, or pre-colonial Central America, wouldn't marry till around at the age of 20 or older. Once the Spanish come and the Europeans come, it changes to younger ages of 12 and 14, which is crazy, right? Like my son's gonna be 11 years old, like in May. Like that means like one more year, and if he was a girl, he could be married, right? And that's some wild stuff to think about, you know. Like I like some of y'all may have little sisters or something like that, like they're that age. Like think about them having to be married, you know, like that's weird and kind of it's sick. You know what I mean? It's gross. And they'd be married. It wasn't like they'd be married to like another 12-year-old. Like they'd be married to like a grown ass man, you know. And so it was pretty disgusting. And that was brought over for that. Like my and the thing about it is it was something that perpetuated. Like my grandmother, um, she got married when she was 13 years old, and so did my aunt. And I was like a normal thing, you know what I mean? And they married men that were a lot older than them. Not like my grandfather was like I think 7 years older than my grandmother, so he was already 20, but she was 13-year-old little girl marrying a 20-year-old man. You know what I mean? Like that's still weird, man. That's like some of y'all are 20, like getting married to like a 13-year-old. You know what I mean? It's just strange, you know. Um, and so, like I said before, Native women had rights of owning property, although they were some seen as inferior roles. A lot of times, by larger social classes, in like the like what would be considered like the middle or working class, it wasn't. They weren't seen as that. They were seen as being equals in many ways in regard to like work and what they did. You know what I mean? Especially like merchants. Like a lot of merchants were women, and they owned all their property. They owned all their goods and stuff like that. Like it wasn't owned by the husband, and you know, like weird shit like that. That wasn't a thing. Um, but in after contact happens and after they start establishing colonial Central America, native noblemen who were married to the conquerors and brought a dowry were more easily assimilated than lower class natives. So like if they were going to marry, and that's really mostly how it happened, is it was going to be people that had money that were already well to do would marry into like the conquerors classes, but they had to bring a dowry with them. So the dowry, and it wasn't. They didn't even know what the hell a dowry was before. Really, it wasn't brought. It was brought in by the Europeans. So that wasn't another interesting thing. The other thing too is uh, very few of the religious schools dedicated education to females or women, right? And so by the 1700s, a third population of Mexico City were more women, and majority had lower jobs and held either Indian or mestizo women in the world, becoming machista than ever. And so they started becoming mixed, right, more than ever. But those populations weren't allowed to attend school or anything like that. They were just considered workers. Um, and so that's another element that was really really wild. And then like women had more of a say in like religious ceremonies and stuff like that, obviously, like you hear about it like in, or you see it in the movies and stuff like that, where women played a big role in like rituals and ceremonies during the pre-contact times. And then after that they're like, it's not the same once conversion of Catholicism and stuff like that changes that. And that inferiority continues to be a major element of the experience. And so that's really pushed heavily with this group. Um, and that's like basically what happens during this time. And then we're going to see that like when we learn about Mestizaje and stuff like that too, we learn about other elements of it. Oh, the other thing too is like with education, like the Spanish, and I talked about this a little bit, but they had schools there, and they were like public schools, and they taught them different stuff and things like that. But women could go to school, but once the religious schools end up being um implemented, they don't allow women to practice. The only way you could do it is if you were to become a nun or or something like that, like a sister. That was the only way you could really do it. Otherwise, you just were supposed to have babies and make the house look nice and stuff, you know. So that's like where that idea comes from. Um, so it's a crazy time. Um, and like I don't know, like every time I think about this and start talking about it, it always like makes me wonder about like, you know, like my history with this, like what was it like for my family and stuff like that. And like I always tell people like you know, like when you're a little kid and you're like, man, if I had a time machine, I'd go back and see the dinosaurs and shit like that. Like that's what I thought when I was a kid. And then now I'm like, I would like to go back and see like what my family was like during these times, you know, and stuff like that. So it's kind of a weird thought, but interesting at the same time. Any questions